everyone, and welcome back to the Voices of Forestry podcast. I'm your host, Seth Stevenson, the communications coordinator with the Arkansas Forestry Association. And today it's time yet again to hear from another voice of forestry. Today I'm joined by Chandler Barton, a division forester with the Arkansas Department of Agriculture Forestry Division. Chandler, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you taking some time out of everyone's buck-wild schedule.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, Seth. And that's a mouthful. Department of Agriculture Forestry Division. And my job title is Division Forester, but I still hold a lot of the responsibilities of Forest Health Specialist.
And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today is some forest health issues, specifically invasive species. This is something we work with Chandler a lot, and he's always really good about getting us information about different types of invasive species and other forest health related issues. But before we get into that, Chandler, just if you could kind of explain to me what it is you do in the division. Now, before we hop into that, if you haven't heard our episode on the Forestry Division, I believe it's our third episode, go back, take a listen to that so you can kind of have a little bit of background knowledge on what the division does overall. But Chandler is a piece of this puzzle. Explain to us, though, what it is that you do with the division.
Yeah, exactly a piece. We do a lot of different things with the Department of Ag Forestry Division. And so my piece, mostly my piece is having to do with forest health on landscape scale, but also I delve into some issues on the urban landscape as well. So as division forester, I oversee several different management programs within either forest health, urban forestry. We also have some other programs known as the Forest Legacy Program, and I get involved in some GIS applications. So any sort of federal grant money that we receive in order to deliver services to private landowners, I'm very much involved in that. And the forest health part is kind of my passion. That's what I really, went to school for, learned the trade and entomology, forest health was really my background and what got me going. And so prior to more recent duties in the office, I was often around the state looking at trees that had some sort of affliction and learned what was causing it and what to do about it. A lot of it going into sound forest management being the prerequisite to a healthy forest. And so, gosh, what don't we do? There's a lot that we get involved in. Even there's a meeting coming up pretty soon where I'll be listening in on the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. Mm-hmm. So forests play a great role in pollinator habitat and restoration as well. So we get our hands in a lot of different things.
Okay. Well, one thing, that is a big part of forest health, and we talked with Luke Lewis with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission last month a little bit about this, is the species that make up or that inhabit the forest, both plant, flora, fauna, all of that good stuff. Last month, Lewis told us about feral hogs, which is an invasive species to Arkansas, but we're going to go a little bit of a smaller scale for some of the species we're talking about today.
Literally.
Literally a smaller scale for sure. But Chandler, if you could, just what exactly is an invasive species? Could you just kind of set up that definition before we move forward?
Absolutely. And the feral hog point was very a very good one to mention. So that's a very large invasive species that we can identify. So it also can apply to the insects we'll talk about today and maybe the plants or diseases that can be found. But an invasive species is something that causes detriment to environment or person. And so it is non-native to the place where it is found, and it causes harm. And the harm can be defined on different levels. It can sometimes be subjective to the observer. But we generally classify invasive species that cause environmental or economical harm, and they are in a place where they are not supposed to be.
Okay. So what exactly are some of the invasive species that we see here in Arkansas, or that you work, or I guess study or work with more often here in the state?
Yeah, probably the most well-known forest invasive species right now. Everyone has probably heard the words emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is an invasive species. It's a little beetle, a jewel beetle, quite pretty actually. I brought one here with me if you wanted to take a look on your display.
Yeah, for sure. We'll Chandler brought in some stuff for us to look at. We'll take some photos and post it to our social media. You can follow the Arkansas Forestry Association on Facebook. That's where we'll post a lot of stuff, and on Twitter. And you can see some of those photos as we move forward talking about some of these species.
Okay. And so a little more about emerald ash borer. We first confirmed the presence of emerald ash borer in Arkansas back in 2014. It has since spread to numerous counties, and it can be found through about a third of the state right now. And those confirmations were done through trapping or observation of infested trees. So emerald ash borer is native to the Asian countries in Eastern Asia. And it was introduced theoretically through trade in Michigan, and has since spread through most of the natural range of ash. Ash can be very valuable economically. It's also extremely important ecologically. It's a very important species in bottomland hardwood forests. It's a very easy to establish early successional species, so it's a great loss to forestry to not have ash in the future, and that's what emerald ash borer is doing. It's extirpating that species from our forests, and at this point, there's no stopping it. It's beyond the point of controlling or restricting the movement. It will spread. And now we have to talk about what will we do in recovery, and how do we make a less susceptible, resistant tree in the future. So it's a bit of a sad story with invasive species, especially one like emerald ash borer. But we've learned a lot over the past couple decades that we've had the insect. We've learned how trees respond, how do they actually defend against a threat like this. Emerald ash borer isn't really much of a nuisance back in its native countries. So we've learned why the trees are immune to it there. They also have ash that can defend against emerald ash borer. Our native trees cannot. So that is generally what makes an invasive threat so bad, is that we don't have the natural defenses, natural enemies, or resistances to them, and they go unchecked when they establish.
So this might be not the best analogy, especially nowadays, but it's essentially like a disease. If a foreign disease enters an area that it affects a species or whatever that doesn't have an immune system to it, or is immune to it, it just can decimate whatever it affects.
That analogy does work, and we often associate forest health, the word health, being associated with the health that we know very well, our own human health. So yeah, that analogy can work, and so we have our own natural defenses against certain pathogens, and we get sick and are able to overcome it and recover. Forest, individual trees, they also have that capacity as well. But what makes some of the worst invasive pests and pathogens are ones that they cannot defend against.
Okay. Now, you'll have to excuse me because I'm probably going to ask you a lot of dumb questions, but like I've mentioned before on this podcast, I'm kind of learning with the audience. But is it a timing issue? Like if we had caught the emerald ash borer maybe a little earlier and found out how to defend against it, would that have prevented us from getting to where we are now? Or
yeah, that is. I'm so glad you brought that up. There's a terminology we use, the invasion curve. So
And I'm assuming these invasive species, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but these invasive species all kind of get to the states in a similar manner. I mean, is that correct? I mean, you mentioned with emerald ash, it was through trade. Is that a pretty standard? Is that how you guys usually see these invasive species getting over here, or does it vary?
Yeah, it depends on the behavior of the insect. Wood-boring insects like emerald ash borer, or a new one that we can talk about today is Asian longhorn beetle. They will spend a long period of their life cycle in wood. Okay. And so one pathway for entry into the U.S. is through trade. And so when you have something like pallets or dunnage packing material made from wood, and it was not, there was not controls in place to kill what was inside of it, then the insect just has a home to move from country to country. And so the best guess is that emerald ash borer arrived that way, as well as Asian longhorn beetle, and was able to escape that material and find a resource nearby, a host tree, and then begin to establish itself. At that point, we need to catch it very rapidly. So there are a lot of people looking at these ports, these very high volume trade areas, and then that's kind of the pinpoint or target for an invasion front from an invasive insect.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because you wouldn't imagine, a huge swarm flying across the ocean from wherever just to go to town on our ash trees or whatever it is.
Yeah, so we're partly to blame. Humans spread invasive species. We're chiefly involved in making them move from one place to another by themselves. They don't necessarily move that far. Emerald ash borer itself can fly a few miles, but it's looking for its nearest resource, and then it stays there for a year. But we can move it hundreds of thousands of miles, through shipping containers, and then hundreds of miles when we're moving something like firewood that's infested with the insect. And that's a good guess for how it might have gotten into southern Arkansas. Emerald ash borer, we were thinking back in 2014 that you'd see it on the Missouri border first because they had it a while. Lo and behold, you find it in South Arkansas, well ahead of any other known existing emerald ash borer population. So a good guess would be that we put it there on accident.
Yeah. And I guess that's another thing too is, again, I'm making an assumption, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this isn't done intentionally, that it's usually an accident because, like you said, there was no control over eradicating it in the first place. It just happened to be there and spread once it got here.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's certainly an accident. And part of it is not knowing where an insect can be harbored, how it can be spread. And so there's been a lot of public campaigns, especially the firewood aspect. There's a "Don't move firewood" is the catchphrase for a nationwide campaign talking about just the threat that can occur when you move something long distance like firewood that has insects in it. And so the general rule of thumb is to keep firewood where it was cut, burn it where it was made, unless it is treated. So you can have kiln treated firewood, and that's typically what you buy when you buy the shrink wrap packaged firewood at the grocery store or something like that. But yeah, so there's a lot of outreach, education involved in teaching people about invasive threats, and I think there might be a light bulb moment for a lot of people when they realize just what they're dealing with and how it might have moved, and hopefully it changes some behavior so we can limit spread in the future. But it's a challenging subject, and for something like emerald ash borer, we're now taking all the research, still conducting so much research that the next step is still yet to be determined. But there's a lot of effort going into thinking about how we restore our lost resource.
So it's a know your enemy type of situation right now, just gathering that knowledge and trying to get a plan to move forward. So, well, you mentioned the Asian longhorn beetle. Let's kind of dive into that real quick. Is this a new invasive species that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I did say new, but it's not super new to the United States as a whole. It is new to the southern United States. So Asian longhorn beetle has been discovered in multiple places in the Northeast in Midwestern states over the past 20 years, I'd say. But only this year has it been discovered in South Carolina. This is a much greater southern climate than it has ever been discovered in before. And so the alarming thing about it is that this insect has a wide host range. It tends to favor maples, but it also likes elm, willow, and so many other species that are ecological importance to Arkansas forests. So we must be mindful of watching for this insect, knowing what to look for, knowing who to ask if you think you might suspect it. And you can see that the Asian longhorn beetle is quite striking. It's a very obvious insect. It is a longhorn beetle of the family Cerambycidae. We have another very common cerambycid that's a native insect that a lot of our foresters know about. That's the pine sawyer beetle. If you see a dying pine tree, you can almost guarantee to see pine sawyer beetle in it. So longhorn beetles are nothing new to us, but this one in particular is an invasive threat because it will attack trees that are seemingly healthy. And over time, they just won't defend well against Asian longhorn beetle repeatedly infesting it. So it can spread and establish on its own. It's a very robust beetle, so it can fly and find its resource effectively. And just like the emerald ash borer, it could be moved long distances by humans. So we need to be on the lookout for it. Asian longhorn beetle has been eradicated in other places it has been discovered, such as several locations near New York, the Brooklyn area. It's been eradicated there through removal of the host material, which can be pretty alarming because the only effective way to stop an insect is to take away its food source.
Yeah.
And with something like a wide host range that the Asian longhorn beetle goes after, you got to remove a lot of trees. So it is possible in the early confirmation and finding of this insect to eradicate it, but it's going to take a huge effort. South Carolina is making some very quick, vast strides at figuring out where the infestation is and how to deal with it. It's going to be a big undertaking. We hope that they're able to succeed, because if it continues to spread there, who knows how far it's going to go.
Yeah. Well, what are some telltale signs that, a tree that I have or a tree on my farm is being affected by, I guess, any invasive species, whether it be the emerald ash borer or the Asian longhorn? What do I need to be on the lookout for, I guess?
And it's quite tricky to have a trained eye for what looks strange. And so we often ask to have reports of dying trees, which happens all the time in Arkansas. We have some pretty harsh weather conditions that can stress trees to the breaking point, and they will die. So I get quite a few calls. Our foresters get quite a few calls about dying trees. It's something that looks abnormal that really catches our attention. So we welcome any reports of trees that look strange. They have a weird growth on them. There's some beetles that you can find on the tree. It died suddenly. I hear that phrase quite often. So then we investigate and start ruling out causes. And you almost have to be kind of a detective, a tree detective in these cases. You got to say what it wasn't, what could have contributed. And it's not always one specific thing that caused the tree to die. So at that point, hopefully we can identify if something we have not yet observed before is there. If someone called me about a dying ash tree, I would first see where it was located, if it's near a known infestation of emerald ash borer. If it's not, then we should investigate, see if there's any signs of emerald ash borer, and start picking out the symptoms that really cue us into an invasive threat. So with Asian longhorn beetle, that can be quite difficult. You're going to look for round holes coming out of the tree, but that's not the only insect that can cause that type of sign. And so if we see something that looks like an invasive borer, we can take samples, try to find the causal organism, and get an ID on it. But none of those steps happen unless someone reports it. So it's very, very important to get reports of something that looks odd, and then we can properly investigate and figure out if anything truly is abnormal.
So it sounds like, again, something else that we've talked about a lot with other folks on various episodes of Voices of Forestry is there is a teamwork aspect to all of this. You can't do what you do without the help from the public who are out there in the woods on their farms seeing this potential damage. That you need them to get in touch with you to let you know about what might be going on.
Yeah, and I've said a couple times the we have done this or done that, and the we is a huge network of agencies, institutions, private individuals. I mean, the amount of people that get involved in researching, identifying, and managing some of these invasive threats is huge. So academia probably going to be chiefly involved in the research aspect. State and federal entities are often involved in the delimiting factors, finding the insect, notifying the proper resources about when and what to do about it. And of course, the private aspect is working with private landowners and getting all the information, the history they have, knowledge of what's going on their property. So that's another thing. When we visit and take a look at some trees that something strange is going on, we need background information, because usually when we look at something, we're getting a snapshot. So the history of what's occurred on the property, what's occurred around the tree is going to be very important for us figuring out what the cause was. So I think we're getting a little off topic about invasive threats, but that's me in a nutshell. Is we do a lot of different things.
Well, if you don't mind, one thing that I know you wanted to talk about, and I kind of wanted to talk about as well, is that the idea of an invasive species isn't just a hog or an insect. There are invasive plants as well that you work with.
Yeah, and I wish we worked with it more. So I guess my call to action here is that invasive plants are a very big threat to not only forestry, which I'm chiefly involved in, but every landscape use that we have in Arkansas. Invasive plants are going to be a struggle for agriculture as well, for control. And then grasslands also have numerous invasive plants that can limit the native species available in that ecosystem. So I'm more involved in the forestry side of things, and I can pinpoint several species that we see often and encourage folks to control. So if we go by the statistics or the numbers, Chinese privet is going to be the most common invasive species in the forest according to forest inventory and analysis data. Chinese privet is very easy to identify. It stays green throughout the year. And it left unchecked, it can almost blanket an understory in some forests. So what that does is it changes the ecosystem, and there is less available native plants for some of our native fauna. The pollinators, insects in the forest, the birds that feed on them. When you add more and more invasive plants to an ecosystem, the less biodiversity that will support. So that is the biggest reason why invasive plants can be a problem, is ecologically it can be pretty devastating when they fully establish in an ecosystem. Some of the up and coming invasive plants in the forests are going to be Chinese tallow tree. Tallow tree is encroaching northward from the Gulf states. It's quite common in Louisiana now, and is starting to become more common in southern Arkansas. And if there's any listeners in the Little Rock area, if they're ever walking in Two Rivers Park, you will see a lot of Chinese tallow tree in that park. It's a very unfortunate observation, because they will continue to become more numerous if left unchecked. And so bringing it up today is, my point is that we need a bit more education of what an invasive plant is, how it can be harmful, and then also there isn't enough action in stopping them from spreading. So some states have invasive species councils. They have numerous agencies, entities working together to set up programs and options for landowners to deal with invasive threats. We don't have much of that in Arkansas yet, but we could. And some of the forest management recommendations we make now are great for controlling invasive plants. Prescribed fire, for instance, is very effective at controlling a lot of invasive plants. And also we have native plant species that respond very positively to repetitive fire in some ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So we have some tools that are easy to implement that we already are very good at. We just need to promote how they can change the landscape for the better. So an invasive plant like tallow tree, I guess the biggest takeaway for why it's bad, everyone wants to know, well, it's a beautiful tree.
Yeah.
Why is it bad?
Yeah.
Is that it doesn't provide much ecologically. So let's go to the basic idea. If we have a plant that's fed on by a caterpillar, the caterpillar in turn is fed on by a bird, which may feed its young, and circle of life there. It's an established ecosystem. You've got different levels, trophic levels within it, but you have nothing but an invasive plant species. Nothing feeds on it, herbivores, and it stops right there. You don't support higher trophic levels. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, biodiversity is something that needs to be protected. And us as landowners, private landowners, and even state and public landowners, I mean, we're stewards of that. So keeping invasive plants at bay is our responsibility.
So I guess one way people can look at it is an entity taking resources but providing nothing back to the area. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So we gain a lot from walking on a trail, walking in amongst the trees, and that's the sounds of the birds. That's the shade that trees provide. Something like privet or tallow tree is going to negatively affect that. You're going to get less biodiversity, less birds interacting with the public. You're going to get the dominant shade tree species are going to be crowded out. Mm-hmm. They're going to be less likely to survive or reproduce, to have the seedling grow into a new tree, because the ground is blanketed with an invasive species. So you can very much adversely affect the way we enjoy our environment when you add invasive species to it. One thing I try to talk to people about when we talk about plants is that horticulturalists and gardeners love a plant that's not fed on by an insect. It doesn't have a harsh appearance. It's beautiful and pleasing to the eyes, but something that's beautiful and pleasing to the eyes may not provide anything to the environment around it other than looking pretty. Mm-hmm. And so we have to become more comfortable with seeing a leaf fed on by an insect. That's a beautiful thing in itself, and a lot of people miss that because they want to see the perfect, immaculate leaf and flower, and not so much the interaction that a plant has with its environment.
Yeah, I guess aesthetics are a big factor for a lot of people. And that's I've honestly never thought of it that way.
And there's a stat that I looked up recently. It was 85% of invasive plants, I don't want to get this wrong, were introduced through gardens or horticulture. Mm-hmm. Accidentally. They get out of a controlled environment, spread either by seed or other means. And so that's a majority of things that we brought in here just for aesthetics, really.
Yeah.
And then they've become a nuisance. So it's a shame that the way we look at plants and our yards, for that matter, doesn't necessarily jive with the natural ecosystem. A lush, low grass, Bermuda grass yard is not natural. Mm-hmm. I don't care what anyone says. It's really not. And it's devoid of a lot of life. There's some excellent books out that most of the people that talk about this are going to recommend, and they're by a author named Doug Tallamy, who has some books called Bringing Nature Home. And he educates in the fact that we have to be more open to the ecosystem services that native plants provide. And so even changing half of your yard to a native landscape is a huge improvement to the surrounding area. You're going to see more insects, more butterflies, more pollinators, more birds. The benefits are as much as you can imagine. We can be creative with how we landscape our yards. But invasive plants, I should say non-native plants in the landscape are not necessarily a bad thing if they do not have the capacity to become invasive.
Okay.
So non-native and invasive can be two different things. Non-native just means it's not native to that area. Mm-hmm. Invasive means it escapes and becomes a negative factor on the place you put it.
Okay. That's a good distinction, I guess, that we need to make.
So, there may be some non-native species planted in downtown Little Rock, which is fine. It's serving a purpose there aesthetically, and it doesn't necessarily have the ability to benefit the native environment if it's surrounded by nothing but sidewalk and buildings. So in that way, non-natives can be okay. It's when they have the capacity to become invasive that's a problem.
Okay. Well, Chandler, we're wrapping up here, but one thing I want to ask you is there a website or a place that people can go if they want to see what some of these invasive species look like, whether it's plants or insects? Is there a place that they can go to kind of educate themselves a little further on what these things look like?
Yeah. If we talk mostly about forest invasive threats, you're going to be visiting our website has some links. That's Department of Agriculture, as well as the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension. They have some excellent fact sheets, web pages devoted to educating on invasive threats. One that I turn to a lot for educating our foresters, people involved in forest industry, is foresthealth.net, it's southernforesthealth.net. And there's some excellent webinars straight from the experts themselves, talking about some of the heavy hitter pests in the forest landscape, some of which are invasive. And so that's a good resource. And of course, still, report and help us find some of these things that look quite unusual. If you've got, just an outlandish example, I've got a 40-acre forested lot, and I've noticed all the black gum are dying. I'm not saying this is really happening, but if that to me sounds strange, so we'd love to hear about it. Just anything that is abnormal.
And do people need to contact their local forestry division people, or is there one place that they need to go to specifically?
So I would advise locating their nearest county work center or district office. Those can be found on our Department of Ag website, but we have a direct line number to the headquarters as well, and then we can get you to the right place.
Okay. All right, and we will try to have some links to all of these places that Chandler has been talking about in the description of this podcast to help you guys out. But Chandler, I think this is going to wrap us up. I appreciate you, again, taking time out of your schedule. I know everyone's been kind of buck wild right now. We are currently in our conference room that has been just about destroyed with us trying to get it situated for our virtual annual meeting. But we thank you, Chandler, for coming and talking to us.
Yeah, this is a very comfortable conversation environment, so I very much enjoyed it. I hope there's a lot that people take in and questions answered, but also if questions come to mind following this, we're around. So reach out to us, Cooperative Extension, AFA, of course, and we'll get you the answers you need. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, this is always about education. Like I said, I'm learning with you guys. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with someone, and we'll try to get those answered, because I'm sure we missed a couple things here on the podcast, but we've only got so much time in the day. But again, we want to thank you for listening to the Voices of Forestry. We also want to thank, as always, some guy named Rob McCormick for the use of our theme song, The Same Love, off of his album, The Folkster. You can find more of his music on Spotify or wherever you get your music. And if you want more information about the Arkansas Forestry Association, you can visit artforest.org. That's ARKFORESTS.org. Thank you once again for listening, as always, to the Voices of Forestry podcast.